We've all heard of Napoleon. We've all heard he was great. But was he? Our team of expert pupils have embarked on an epic journey to discover the real reason why Napoleon fell from greatness to nothing. Meet the team! Will Shaw, studying history at King's Bruton. Fred Bruford, studying history at King's Bruton. Lorna Blackmore, studying history at King's Bruton. And Seb Brain, studying business. Come with us now on our epic journey to discover the truth.
We will begin our journey through Napoleon's downfall with the role of the British, possibly the main underlying cause of his failure. Had they not evaded Napoleon's grip like they did, many of the later reasons of Napoleon's downfall, such as the Continental system, Russian campaign, Peninsular War and War of Liberation, may not have happened. The British had been part of every coalition against Napoleon since he had taken power, and were always of great annoyance to him due to their supreme naval and economic power, making them immune to Napoleon's armies that had been so successful in mainland Europe. Their main role against Napoleon was their continuous funding of his enemies. With their huge overseas empire generating huge amounts of wealth, they were able to give huge sums of money to the Sixth Coalition in 1813 and 1814. For example, they gave £5 million to Russia and £5.3 million to Sweden. They also provided arms, such as 100,000 muskets to Russia. As a result, Napoleon's enemies were encouraged to continue the fight against Napoleon rather than give in, and prevented the coalition from falling apart as Napoleon had intended. They established the Treaty of Chaumont in 1814, which united the Allies under one goal: to destroy Napoleon. Furthermore, the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 established full naval supremacy for Britain and ended all hopes for Napoleon's French invasion of the island. As a result, the only way Napoleon could harm them was to attack their economy through the Continental system, which had devastating consequences for Napoleon. The Continental system was established by the Berlin Decrees in November 1806. It entailed that all European countries were to cease all trade with Britain in order to financially cripple the country. In 1807, the Milan Decrees stated that all ships that visit a British port would be confiscated. It worked to a degree. British exports fell from £40.8 million in 1806 to £35.2 million in 1808, while grain prices rose by 30%.
However, the Continental system had far more detrimental effects on Napoleon's Europe. Major ports such as Amsterdam and Bordeaux declined greatly during the period due to lack of trade with Britain. Europe lacked essential goods such as textiles, cocoa and coffee, which in turn resulted in a severe lack of supplies for the army, such as boots, which were made in Northampton, and uniforms, which were made in Yorkshire. Meanwhile, smuggling and corruption of officials undermined the system, and Napoleon had to spend vast amounts of money on enforcement. If relaxed just a little, the British goods would flood back into the continent. In 1811, just as Britain was reaching its breaking point, Napoleon began selling grain back to Britain.
Therefore, the Continental system ultimately failed, and the negative impacts far outweighed the positive. Lack of supplies in most countries and the favouritism Napoleon placed on French industries led to the rise of nationalism against the French invaders, particularly in Germany and Spain. The system also cost Napoleon support at home because it severely damaged many businesses owned by the bourgeoisie. Most importantly, however, the system required Napoleon to invade Portugal and Spain, resulting in the Peninsular War, and when Russia opted out of the Continental system, Napoleon commenced the fateful Russian campaign of 1812. Both campaigns failed, with devastating effects for Napoleon.
The Peninsular Wars, Napoleon's Spanish ulcer. Lasting from 1807 to 1814, the Peninsular Wars were another crippling mistake of Napoleon's that led to his downfall. The Peninsular Wars began in 1807 when Napoleon received permission from the Spanish to move a French army through it to Portugal. Portugal had for some time been defying Napoleon's continental system by continuing to trade with Britain after Napoleon was trying to stop it. If Portugal continued to trade with Britain, the whole system would be obsolete. Napoleon's plan was to invade Portugal by first taking over Spain, then moving on to control the whole of the Iberian Peninsula. However, this did not go to plan, largely due to the guerrilla tactics of the Spanish. Napoleon was stopped in his tracks, and ultimately the wars ended up as just a very costly and time-consuming stalemate. Over the whole 7-year occupation, Napoleon lost 250,000 men in Spain, and he had to commit 300,000 per year. The Peninsular Wars were a critical misjudgment of Napoleon. He had underestimated Spain in his haste to enforce his system on Portugal, and this led to his downfall. Napoleon had to continually divert troops from his other European campaigns to Spain. This was particularly evident during the disastrous German campaign of 1813, where 200,000 French troops had to stay in Spain. It was also very bad for Napoleon's propaganda. This image that had been spread in France of Napoleon as an invincible, undefeatable military genius was shattered by defeats in places like Vittoria and Vimiero. This both weakened French morale and strengthened the morale of the Allies. In short, the Peninsular Wars did very little save for weaken Napoleon, his army, and his hold on power.
Another significant effect of the Continental system was the Russian campaign of 1812. It occurred because Napoleon needed to invade Russia because Tsar Alexander I had pulled out of the Continental system. Had he let this happen, British goods would have entered Russia and therefore entered Europe, and the whole system would have failed. On the 24th of June 1812, the Grande Armée of approximately 250,000 men, with a further 300,000 as reinforcements, embarked on what was to become one of the most disastrous campaigns in history, the invasion of Russia. The Russians intentionally retreated at every opportunity to give battle, except for the Battle of Borodino, in which the French, fighting in -30 degrees C, snatched victory at the cost of 30,000 men, while the Russians retreated with their army intact, although with greater casualties. By the time the Grande Armée had reached Moscow, only 100,000 of Napoleon's original 250,000 central force remained, most dying of disease, exhaustion, and exposure. The campaign took a further turn for the worse. Russians burnt 3/4 of the city, forcing Napoleon to abandon the campaign and return to France rather than face the winter with no supplies whatsoever. The retreat was an utter catastrophe, as French soldier Jean-Paul Guellier is to describe.
No food, no supplies, just cold, freezing men in their sleep. Those who had the strength to survive in freezing cold could barely lift their muskets against the constant harassment by Cossack cavalry. At every encounter with a breathless river, hundreds of men were too weak to make it across, being swept away into oblivion by the icy waters. But what more life was driven on the heartless bodies of men so weak from exhaustion, killing men in their thousands. The dying victims hunted together on roads and straw, and their own extreme freezed them on the dead horses, and in few cases, even human flesh.
Overall, 400,000 men had died during the campaign. A large percentage of all those who had gained experience through Napoleon's previous, more successful campaigns had been lost. Furthermore, 200,000 horses perished, and these could not be replaced. The Grande Armée was destroyed. Napoleon raised a further 400,000 men in the coming year, but these were all fresh conscripts with almost no training or experience, and there was almost no cavalry. The War of Liberation in 1813 was between Napoleon and the Fourth Coalition, consisting of Russia, Prussia, Sweden, Britain, the German states, and Austria. Their aim was to destroy Napoleon and unite Europe. The Treaty of Quantity stated that there could be no conflict whatsoever between the members of the Fourth Coalition until Napoleon was defeated. Napoleon seemed to revert back to his usual tactically aware self with some initial victories, such as at Lutzen and Bautzen. However, the Allies adopted the Trachtenberg Plan, whereby they avoided direct confrontation with armies under Napoleon or French armies of superior numbers. Therefore, they were able to gain numerous victories against some of Napoleon's subordinates, such as at Grossbeeren and Kulm. Finally, at the Battle of Leipzig, which involved over 500,000 men, the biggest battle prior to the First World War, Napoleon was defeated. However, due to great bravery by his men, his army managed to retreat intact past the Rhine, despite 70,000 casualties. As a result of the War of Liberation, any notion of Napoleon as that military genius was completely eradicated, and one by one the German states deserted to the Allies, and gradually Napoleon had to abandon territories, such as the Illyrian provinces and Spain. Napoleon's situation was grim. In France, people were fed up after 20 years of war, and it became very difficult to raise and equip another army. However, he still refused to accept peace terms that would have kept him on the throne, but restored France to its original 1792 frontiers. So the Allies decided the only option left was to invade France.
The War of the Fourth Coalition was the beginning of the end for Napoleon. The Allies occupied Paris on the 31st of March, and France was forced to surrender by the Allies. It was the end for Napoleon. After failing to take his own life with poison, he abdicated reluctantly and miserably on 11th of April due to pressure from the Senate. He was exiled to the island of Elba, where he would spend the rest of his life. Or so it seemed.
After Napoleon's abdication and the restoration of the monarchy, there was a discussion to determine a peace settlement with France. This was agreed at the First Treaty of Paris on the 30th of May 1814. The terms of the treaty included the restoration of France's original frontiers of 1792, the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy in France, and all looted treasures of Napoleon's campaigns were to be returned to the original owners. The wider issue of producing a territorial settlement in Europe, however, was not easily achieved. There were high tensions when the powers met in the Congress of Vienna, mostly over the redrawing of the map of Europe, especially the future of Poland. The Tsar in particular wanted all of it for Russia. Britain and Austria, encouraged by the restoration of the Bourbon government in France, made a secret alliance against Prussia and Russia.
Napoleon escaped exile on Elba and arrived in France at Antibes on 1st of March 1815, when the army under Marshal Ney, sent to arrest him, defected to his side. This was Napoleon's last chance to recover his throne. He proclaimed, "The eagle will fly from steeple to steeple until it reaches the towers of Notre Dame." It took him only 3 weeks to establish his power again. In order to break up the alliance, Napoleon offered to negotiate separately with Austria and Britain, but both rejected. He therefore aimed to defeat the British and Prussian armies in order to force the Russians and Austrians to negotiate a treaty.
He raised an army and aimed to adopt the movement of the central position to defeat the British and Prussians separately. He defeated the Prussians at the Battle of Ligny, but their force remained intact. Napoleon's army then joined Ney's to confront Wellington at Waterloo.
Let this battle commence! One last time! Let this battle commence! One last time!
The battle almost ended up as a stalemate when the remaining Prussian force from Ligny of 81,000 arrived and turned the battle against the French. This was the end for Napoleon. He was utterly defeated. However, some may argue that even had he won at Waterloo, France still lacked the physical strength to overcome the Austrian and Russian forces that were simultaneously marching on Paris. Napoleon was forced to abdicate for the second and final time and was deported 5,000 miles away to the island of St. Helena, where he remained until death in 1821.
One of Napoleon's main weaknesses as a general was his personality. He became more and more convinced as time went on that he was destined to succeed, and nothing could stop him. This was certainly the case in the Russian campaign of 1812, where he ignored his advice from Berthier, his expert chief of staff, to go into Vilna, so he grossly overestimated his ability. It also meant that he rejected favourable peace terms on numerous occasions. For example, the Frankfurt Memorandum, which could have prevented further losses and allowed him to consolidate his fragile position after Leipzig. He also refused to give up the centralised control of civilian administration, as well as military command, which made it very difficult to concentrate fully on military campaigns.
He began to abandon his rationale of quick and decisive victories, and he became more and more concerned about capturing geographical objectives. For example, he became infatuated with occupying Berlin and Prague, then destroying the huge army of 300,000 during the War of Liberation. Instead of concentrating his forces as he usually did, he dispatched an army of 72,000 men to Prague and 102,000 to attack a Prussian army, and both armies were defeated. He also abandoned his battles of tactical mobility for battles of attrition due to his large armies, resulting in catastrophic amounts of casualties, such as at Borodino there were 30,000 French casualties. The huge armies were both difficult to manoeuvre and supply, as was the case for the Russian campaign.
There was even more bad news for Napoleon. His health was also deteriorating. Piles and bladder problems hindered his command at Borodino and Waterloo. Furthermore, his subordinates let him down on numerous occasions, such as during the Peninsular War and Waterloo. They were chosen mainly due to obedience rather than military flair. Many of them resented each other. For example, Ney detested Davout from 1805 onwards, and Massena from 1810. What's worse, the quality of Napoleon's armed forces were getting steadily worse from 1810 onwards.
The army became more and more cosmopolitan by the day. In 1807, a third of the Grande Armée was foreign, while in the Russian campaign, 2/3 were foreign. This had serious consequences when on the second day of the Battle of Leipzig, Saxon and Württemberg troops defected to the Allies. What's worse, casualties among officers increased as the pressure among them to lead charges in order to inspire their men increased. Furthermore, all of the best soldiers in each regiment were drained off to join the Imperial Guard, which was very rarely committed in battle, even at decisive moments in battle, when they could have been made a great impact, such as at Borodino. After the Russian campaign, Napoleon raised 400,000 new troops, of whom tens of thousands had almost no training or experience, rendering his armies virtually useless in the face of newly reformed Allied armies.
Between the years of 1809 and 1815, Napoleon's enemies undertook great modernisation and reform, principally by Austria, Prussia, Russia and Britain. Throughout the 18th century, there had been a huge emphasis on firepower in warfare through the increased scale of men and specific artillery.
However, Napoleon had increased this scale to a whole new degree by developing much larger armies than the world had ever seen before, such as the one he took on the Russian campaign of 500,000 men. The fact that Napoleon had been in almost continuous war since 1800 meant that, once this force had been destroyed, troops were in short supply for him compared to the Allies, who always had ways in which to recruit soldiers quickly and effectively. But there were other, more specific reforms made by the opposition that enhanced their success.
One of the most effective tactics we adopted to protect Russia from French invasion in 1812 was in fact to retreat, and banding my predecessors, focus on retaining territory. This meant that we continually denied Napoleon of his battle of annihilation, and we were able to buy time. This tactic combined with scorched earth policy, whereby we burnt all vegetation and supplies as we retreated so that Napoleon's corpse could not live off the land, meant that the longer we avoided battle, the weaker the Grand Army would get, to the point that we could engage in battle with the knowledge of 100% success. During their retreat, they exacerbated their casualties using Cossack cavalry, fierce mounted soldiers from the southern regions of Ukraine, to pick off Napoleon's weak soldiers with continuous skirmishes.
After our defeat at Austerlitz, I made steps to reform the army. Firstly, I increased the strength of the field army to 350,000. I also copied the French system of independent army corps and regiments of mobile skirmishers, as well as adopting the French-style supply system to increase the mobility of these corps. This almost paid off at Wagram in 1809, where we were only narrowly defeated by the Grande Armée. However, we continually made improvements until we were finally ready to take on the French again in 1813.
Britain always had a strong navy force, which had always impacted decisions of the French, but I exploited this fully. I commanded the British force in 1812, and, although I was a cautious commander, I was able to exploit the French weaknesses, such as lack of supplies, and, at the same time, make full use of the British naval fleet's supremacy to resupply and reinforce our land forces. Under my command, we Brits were able to maintain constant pressure on the French troops, creating an ulcer that wasted French time and resources up until 1814.
Due to these reforms made by the Allies and the fact that the Grande Armée was unable to adjust its operational methods in response, it is understandable to see why this resulted in a loss for France. The increasing unity of the Allies furthered their success because it meant their actions were carefully thought out and their plans in unison. April of 1812, during the invasion of Russia, a document was signed by Britain, Russia and Sweden which contained
secret agreements
against Napoleon. At this time,
Kutuzov
was made commander-in-chief by Tsar Alexander. The fact that the Allies were able to come to this decision easily emphasizes the unity of their opposition to Napoleon. Napoleon's failure during the Russian campaign and the destruction of the Grande Armée encouraged a general diplomatic realignment among the European powers. This began in 1813 with the signing of the anti-French alliance with Russia and Prussia. During the
Peninsular War,
between 1812 and 1814, the
Anglo-Portuguese
army worked well as a coalition force, integrating English and Portuguese troops into each corps successfully. Here, the Allies demonstrated unity against the French, overcoming the language barriers. The Allies also benefited from a centralized high command under Tsar Alexander, who became the effective leader of the Sixth Coalition. The fact that the Allies were content to take orders from one person prevented disputes between the nations, which Napoleon could have exploited.
To think, all of this happened just because of one tiny island with a tiny army and a massive navy. The role of the British resulted in the introduction of a quite absurd system, the Continental system. Not only did this result in almost universal resentment of the French invaders across Europe due to lack of basic supplies and the ruining of their economies, but it forced Napoleon to commence on two disastrous campaigns, the Russian campaign and the Peninsular War, which the British also exacerbated under Wellesley. Combined, they resulted in the obliteration of the Grande Armée, arguably one of the greatest armies the world had ever seen, and it utterly shattered Napoleon's reputation as an invincible general, resulting in a renewed confidence among his enemies to rise up against him and reform. Their unity in the War of Liberation was all due to British funding, thus allowing them to defeat Napoleon. It seems fit that they, who had avoided battle with him for so long, were the one to defeat him in his final battle at Waterloo.
Wheels up inside ya, finding an entrance where they can. Wheels up inside ya, finding an entrance where they can. Boring through your mind, through your tummy, through your anus. Heels. 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 Give it up now. Heels. Give it up now. Heels. Give it up now. I was obsolete. I couldn't never be staggering about on me old man's feet. I had one foot in the grave. But down the rave. But down the rave. It's a mashup. Oh, it's a mashup. Elements of the past.